Cairo wakes to the sound of hammers striking stone, steam engines exhaling by the Nile, and the low murmur of a city being reshaped. Palaces rise where courtyards once stood. Canals cut new paths through old land. The river still flows, but everything around it feels accelerated. To observers abroad, this looks like ambition finally unleashed. Egypt appears to be stepping into a modern age, confident and deliberate. Yet beneath the noise of construction, another sound travels farther and lasts longer. Pens move across paper. Contracts are signed, and with each signature, something essential begins to slip away. The common belief is simple and comforting. Egypt lost its sovereignty to invasion, to soldiers and flags planted by force. But that story begins too late. Long before foreign troops marched through Cairo, the decisive battles had already been fought in quieter places. They unfolded in distant rooms lined with leather chairs and polished desks, far from the heat of the Nile. There were no cannons there, only ledgers, interest rates, and promises framed as opportunity. This is where control first changed hands. Money has always been more than currency. It is permission. It decides who acts and who waits. In 19th century Egypt, control over money slowly became control over the state itself. Rulers believed they were purchasing progress. Railways would bind the country together. Ports would open Egypt to the world. A modern army would secure independence. Each project felt necessary. Each loan felt justified. Together, they formed a future that looked brighter than the past. What was not visible was the price attached to tomorrow. Imagine this: a nation that appears independent, flying its own flag, and governing its own people. Yet every major decision has already been priced elsewhere. Budgets are written with foreign approval in mind. Revenues are promised before they are collected. Choices narrow without announcement. This is not occupation in the traditional sense. It is quieter and more precise. The state still exists, but its freedom is conditional. The deeper Egypt moved into global finance, the more invisible the constraints became. Europe watched closely, not with armies, but with calculators. Egypt's strategic position mattered, but so did its balance sheet. The country stood between continents and oceans, between old trade routes and new ones. Financing its transformation promised returns measured not only in profit, but in influence. Loans were extended with confidence and enthusiasm. They carried the language of partnership and progress. They were framed as tools that would lift Egypt into parity with the great powers of the age. For Egypt's leadership, borrowing did not feel like surrender. It felt like strategy. Integration into global markets suggested protection rather than vulnerability. Credit signaled trust. Trust signaled legitimacy. To be financed by Europe's markets was to be recognized as serious and modern. Few pause to ask who truly benefits when development is prepaid. Fewer still considered what happens when expectations are locked in, but realities shift. Debt does not adjust itself. It waits. The stakes were existential, even if they were not yet visible. Control over finances determines the limits of action. Once revenues are promised, priorities change. Once obligations are fixed, flexibility disappears. Egypt's rulers believed they were managing growth. In reality, they were narrowing the future's options. Each agreement transferred a small piece of authority outward. No single contract felt decisive. Together, they formed a structure that would prove impossible to escape. This is where the story turns contrarian. Power did not arrive first with soldiers. It arrived with terms and conditions. Ink replaced gunpowder. Ledgers replaced chains. The language was technical, even polite, but the effect was absolute. Finance gained leverage where force was unnecessary. Distance no longer mattered. Decisions made in London could shape lives along the Nile without ever being announced publicly. Sovereignty was not seized. It was quietly priced. The central question hangs over everything that follows. How did finance become more powerful than armies? How did bondholders, separated by thousands of miles, gain the authority to dictate the future of a civilization older than Europe itself? This is not a story of sudden conquest. It is a story of quiet capture. Once the trap began to close, escape required options that no longer existed. The loss came not with a battle, but with a balance sheet. To the outside world, Egypt looked ascendant. Cotton moved north in vast quantities, feeding factories that powered Europe's industrial surge. Fields along the Nile had become nodes in a global machine, their output priced, traded, and anticipated far beyond Egypt's borders. Revenue poured in during good seasons, reinforcing the belief that the country had found its place in the modern economy. Wealth appeared tangible, measurable, and growing. Confidence followed naturally. Then came the canal. The Suez Canal did more than cut through land. It collapsed distance and rewrote global trade. Empires were shortened overnight. Shipping lanes shifted. Ports along Egypt's coast transformed into arteries of international commerce. Alexandria filled with merchants, financiers, and diplomats, each sensing opportunity. Cairo expanded outward, its skyline changing to reflect ambition rather than tradition. Egypt was no longer peripheral. It was central, and the world treated it as such. Modernization became visible everywhere. Rail lines stretched across desert and delta, linking farms to ports and cities to each other. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than caravans ever could. Military uniforms were redesigned to resemble European standards, projecting discipline and modernity. Administrative offices multiplied, signaling order and coordination. These were not illusions. They were real achievements, paid for with borrowed capital and sustained by belief in future returns. Egypt's leadership embraced this momentum. Integration into global finance was seen as protection, not exposure. Being tied to powerful markets promised stability and recognition. Loans arrived framed as instruments of partnership. They were not presented as emergency measures, but as accelerants. Borrowing signaled confidence, both from lenders and borrowers. It suggested Egypt was a rising power, not a desperate one. That distinction mattered deeply. International markets responded enthusiastically. Egyptian bonds sold easily. Investors treated them as attractive, even fashionable. Credit was not a warning sign. It was proof of prestige. The more Egypt borrowed, the more legitimate it appeared. Financial confidence fed political confidence, which in turn justified further borrowing. This cycle reinforced itself, masking the risks beneath layers of optimism and ceremony. Institutions emerged to manage this growing complexity. Financial offices were created to oversee revenues, expenditures, and obligations. Advisors arrived, often foreign, bringing expertise and reassurance. Procedures became formalized. Accounts were standardized. To many observers, this looked like progress toward responsible governance. Transparency was praised. Order was admired. The system appeared stable, sophisticated, and aligned with global norms. As long as cotton prices remained strong and trade flowed smoothly, the model worked. Revenues met expectations. Payments were made. Projects continued. Each successful year validated the choices of the last. Doubt seemed unnecessary, even unpatriotic. Egypt was not stagnating. It was modernizing at speed, and speed itself became a symbol of success. Few stopped to consider how little margin remained for error. The illusion of strength rested on momentum. Growth hid fragility. Borrowing against the future assumed the future would cooperate. Markets rewarded optimism, not caution. Leaders were praised for ambition, not restraint. In this environment, slowing down felt dangerous. Expansion created its own logic. Once set in motion, it demanded constant reinforcement. To pause would suggest weakness. and weakness threatened confidence. Europe's financial centers saw Egypt as reliable because it looked productive and disciplined. Revenues were visible. Trade volumes were impressive. Strategic importance added reassurance. Lending to Egypt felt safe, even virtuous. Development and profit appeared aligned. Few questioned what would happen if conditions shifted. Fewer still imagined that success itself could become a vulnerability. Obligations, however, were accumulating quietly. Each loan carried expectations fixed in advance. Future revenues were already spoken for. Flexibility narrowed, though no single decision revealed it clearly. The system rewarded continuation, not reflection. As long as payments were met, concerns stayed abstract. Stability became a performance maintained through constant motion. Egypt was not collapsing. It was thriving, at least on the surface. That is what made the situation so dangerous. Strength delayed scrutiny. Prosperity discouraged restraint. The very signs that convinced the world Egypt was secure also convinced its leaders that risks were manageable. Confidence ruled, and confidence rarely questions itself. Beneath the celebration, the structure was becoming rigid. Commitments hardened. Options disappeared quietly. The future was being organized in advance, its priorities already ranked. What looked like empowerment was also binding. What looked like partnership was already leaning toward dependence. The illusion held because nothing had yet forced it to break. Egypt stood at the height of its apparent power, admired and financed, woven into the global economy. The transformation felt irreversible, and in many ways it was. Not because it guaranteed strength, but because it locked in obligations that would soon begin to speak louder than ambition. The breaking mechanism was not spectacle or scandal. It was leverage, applied patiently and with precision. Egypt's debt was not abstract. It was tied to foreign currencies, foreign markets, and foreign expectations that did not bend to local reality. Payments came due on schedules written far from the Nile. They did not pause for poor harvests or rising costs. They arrived with certainty, and they demanded compliance. When global conditions shifted, pressure appeared immediately. Cotton prices fell, not because Egypt failed, but because markets changed. At the same time, expenses surged. Infrastructure had to be maintained. Administration had to be funded. The state's obligations did not shrink when revenues tightened. They expanded. Budgets closed in on themselves. What once felt manageable now felt urgent. To reassure creditors, concessions followed. They did not arrive with threats. They arrived as recommendations. Oversight was framed as assistance. Financial boards were proposed to stabilize accounts and restore confidence. These bodies demanded visibility first. Access to records. Access to revenue streams. What could be seen could be evaluated. What could be evaluated could be controlled. Soon, tax collection was redirected. Revenues that once funded governance were earmarked for repayment. The order of priorities changed without public debate. Servicing debt came before public works. Creditor schedules outranked domestic needs. This shift marked the true turning point. Sovereignty began to erode not through decree, but through obligation. Each concession reduced Egypt's room to maneuver. Decision-making slowed as approvals multiplied. Local priorities lost weight against foreign expectations. Policies were no longer judged by their effect on society, but by their effect on creditworthiness. Missed payments triggered intervention. Compliance triggered further demands. Cause became effect, and effect justified deeper control. London financiers did not need to rule Egypt. They only needed to secure their returns. To do that, they required authority without responsibility. They demanded enforcement without visibility of consequence. Financial leverage allowed influence without occupation. The state remained formally intact, but its choices narrowed to those that satisfied distant investors. This architecture fed on itself. Debt required oversight. Oversight exposed weakness. Weakness justified expanded authority. Expanded authority further reduced autonomy. At no point did this process require a single dramatic act. It advanced through clauses and conditions, each one defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a system that no longer belonged to Egypt alone. Think about the implications. When a state can no longer decide how to use its own income, is it still sovereign? When revenues are promised before they are collected, governance becomes secondary. Administration turns into compliance. Policy becomes accounting. The language of rules shifts from law to liability. Resistance emerged slowly, because the capture was difficult to see. The mechanisms were technical. The decisions were framed as necessary. Officials spoke of stabilization, confidence, and responsibility. Yet for ordinary people, the effects were tangible. Taxes rose. Services shrank. The burden moved downward as control moved outward. The system protected capital first, stability second, and society last. By the time opposition became organized, the financial structure was already locked in place. There was no simple reversal. Default threatened isolation. Renegotiation required approval from those who benefited from the existing terms. Options that once existed had been traded away for time. The trap had closed, not with force, but with paperwork. What made this moment decisive was its invisibility. No borders changed. No flags fell. Egypt still appeared independent to the casual observer. But inside the machinery of the state, authority had shifted. The power to decide had been replaced by the obligation to comply. Control no longer required presence. Distance became irrelevant. The weapon was economic, but its effects were political and social. Financial discipline imposed from outside altered internal legitimacy. Leaders were seen as enforcers rather than representatives. Policies lost credibility because their purpose was no longer local. Stability was maintained for creditors, not citizens. This gap widened quietly, then dangerously. Once leverage reached this stage, reversal required collapse. The system could not loosen without breaking trust. Trust, in this context, belonged to markets, not people. The state was judged by its ability to pay, not its ability to govern. That inversion sealed Egypt's fate long before any soldier arrived. The capture was complete when enforcement became normalized. Oversight ceased to feel temporary. Intervention felt procedural. Egypt's finances were no longer a national matter. They were an international concern, managed according to external priorities. The state still functioned, but its center had shifted elsewhere. This was the moment when finance proved more powerful than armies. Control was exercised without occupation. Authority was enforced without violence. And once embedded, it could not be removed without dismantling the system itself. Egypt was still standing, but its sovereignty had already been spent. The consequences unfolded slowly, then all at once. What had been technical became personal. As revenues were redirected outward, pressure moved inward. Taxes rose, not to expand services, but to satisfy obligations set elsewhere. Public investment stalled. Infrastructure that once symbolized progress became a reminder of promises already mortgaged. For ordinary Egyptians, the state began to feel distant and extractive, enforcing demands it no longer controlled. Popular anger followed predictably. Farmers felt squeezed by heavier collections. Urban populations saw prices rise while wages stagnated. Decisions that affected millions were justified in the language of necessity, not consent. Legitimacy eroded because authority no longer answered to society. It answered to schedules and repayments. The social contract thinned, strained by a system that protected balance sheets before people. Political stability weakened from within. Leaders found themselves trapped between domestic pressure and foreign expectations. Any attempt to ease the burden risked financial retaliation. Any effort to comply deepened public resentment. Governance became reactive. Crisis management replaced vision. The state's energy was consumed by maintaining credibility abroad while losing it at home. When unrest broke into the open, it did not come as a surprise. It came as confirmation. Protests and resistance provided what foreign powers needed most: justification. Intervention could now be framed as restoration rather than conquest. Order, not control, became the stated objective. Financial capture had prepared the ground. Military presence merely formalized what balance sheets had already decided. Occupation followed debt, not the other way around. Troops arrived to secure stability, protect revenues, and reassure investors. The transition was presented as temporary and necessary. Yet the direction was irreversible. Egypt's autonomy had already been hollowed out. Military force simply enforced an arrangement created long before by contracts and conditions. The bonds were honored. Payments continued. Creditors were made whole. The cost was absorbed locally, distributed across generations. Governance was reshaped to align with external priorities. Economic policy narrowed further, defined by risk management rather than development. What remained of sovereignty existed within boundaries drawn elsewhere. In the long run, Egypt became a template. Its experience demonstrated a new model of empire, one that relied less on borders and more on balance sheets. Financial oversight became a standard instrument of control. Influence could be extended without annexation. Authority could be exercised without administration. Debt made distance irrelevant. The aftermath reached beyond the Nile. Other regions watched and learned, sometimes too late. Development financed without leverage awareness carried hidden risks. Infrastructure could empower, but it could also bind. Credit could accelerate growth, or it could lock in dependency. Egypt's experience exposed how quickly partnership could turn into supervision, and supervision into control. What made this form of domination so effective was its plausibility. Every step could be defended as reasonable. Every intervention was justified as temporary. Responsibility was diffused across institutions and markets. No single actor appeared to be in charge, yet outcomes were decisive. Power operated through systems rather than individuals. Egypt paid the price and lost autonomy, reshaped governance, and decades of external influence. The civilization endured, but its direction was constrained. Decisions that once belonged to the state became subject to approval. The future was no longer open-ended. It was scheduled. This story is not ancient history. It is a warning written in contracts, still relevant wherever development is financed faster than sovereignty can absorb. Money moves faster than armies now, but the logic remains the same. Control the debt, and control follows. Empires no longer need to invade to dominate. They only need to be owed. Egypt's capture was quiet, methodical, and predictable. It shows that collapse does not always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it arrives as compliance. Sometimes it is signed away, clause by clause, in the name of progress. When sovereignty becomes collateral, recovery requires more than resistance. It requires understanding how power truly operates. If this story resonated, it is because its pattern repeats. The past is not worn loudly. It waits to be recognized. For those who seek more stories like this, shaped by history and driven by hidden economics, this is the moment to subscribe and share.